Hello and welcome to the next episode 12 of our webinar series, Mental Health and Wellbeing in COVID-19. My name is Theron Nidenfit, and next to me I have Mark Baker. You want to say hi?
How's it, everyone? Good to be here with you again, Theron.
Good to be here. Yeah, always good to be here. I'm looking forward to today's topic. We're looking at how health is more than physical. We'll get there in a second. Let's do a brief recap of what we covered in the previous webinar. A couple of key concepts. We were speaking about the heart-brain connection and specifically the impact of how that plays out when it comes to how we cope with stress. And then we talked about a few EQ techniques to be able to remain healthy, and we spent a bit of time unpacking some practical applications around how do we reduce our stress. The key question we asked is, what is the cost of your stress? And I trust that was an interesting and helpful webinar. If you didn't catch it, please go and grab a look at the rerun. Today we have a guest who will be joining us a little bit later, but I will introduce her when the time comes. Okay, so health is more than physical. We're going to be speaking about a concept called emotional hygiene and how self-compassion is one of the ways that we can actually achieve and maintain emotional and psychological hygiene. And we're going to talk about what it looks like to really give yourself a bit of an emotional break. How do you give yourself a break with self-compassion? And then we're going to be unpacking some really practical ways in which we can sort of help ourselves in tough times. Of course, right now, we are in tough times. Okay, so that's where we're at. Mark, I'm going to walk us through some of this research and some of these ideas from Guy Winch. Is there anything you'd like to contribute before I jump in? Because I might be speaking for a little while.
No, just that I think, this has been a particularly difficult aspect of my life is emotional hygiene. It's something I haven't been particularly good at. And so I think this is going to be a particularly valuable webinar for the listeners out there. If there's anyone that, like me, has had a particular struggle in this area. So why don't you jump in there and I'll share a little bit later.
Yeah, and I think, thanks for sharing that from your own perspective. I think it's probably true for many people. And the reason I would say that is because this whole concept of emotional hygiene is, I think, once we talk about it, it's quite intuitive. But before that, it's a bit of a blind spot for many people. And this is what the work of Guy Winch has really helped us to understand. Guy Winch is a psychologist who I think specializes in this whole idea of how do we take care of ourselves emotionally and psychologically. He says that when we stub our toe or cut our finger, everybody knows what to do. You got to clean the wound. You got to go and get some kind of antiseptic. You got to put a plaster, and then over the next couple of days, we're very aware of that wound. We treat it with extra respect. Maybe we use our other hand instead of the injured one to do routine tasks that we would have done with both hands. We're hyper aware of these injuries. And he says even young children know and understand what needs to be done when we have some kind of physical injury. But then he goes on to speak about the fact that things like loneliness and rejection and failure are injuries to our psyche, injuries to our emotional being in the world. And so much of the time we just ignore those things. He says you'd never dream, he gives us an example of someone who breaks their leg and you'd never say to them, oh, go walk it off, But when someone has a tough time, or if they're, suffering from depression or something, sometimes some people have responded with, oh, you're going to just get over it or just pull yourself together. But you can't do that with a physical injury. And his suggestion and more than suggestion, his imperative to us is don't do that with psychological and emotional wounds as well, because they actually happen way more often than physical wounds do, and they have a huge impact. He looks at some of the research around chronic loneliness, and we've talked a little bit in the previous webinars about the impact of isolation, the impact of some of those studies with solitary confinement, and what happens with loneliness. And it's well documented, and he brings our attention to the fact that it can actually increase our chance of an early death by 14%. I mean, that is massive. It's on par with smoking. And as you can see here on the slide, we're saying here that loneliness is greater or equal to the impact of a nicotine addiction on your health. It increases the risk of developing depression and Alzheimer's later in life. It weakens your immune system, making you susceptible to all sorts of other health risks, more susceptible than you would have been. And yet so much of the time we don't even give a thought to this. We don't think of this as an injury, as wounding. And instead of maintaining self-care, we give ourselves a hard time. We say to ourselves, "Oh, get over it. Pull yourself together." And we engage in this negative self-talk that takes us down a negative, downward spiral, like we've already spoken about in previous webinars. What has often been presented as the solution to that is self-esteem. You just gotta have a better self-esteem, and everything will get sorted out. But it seems that in recent years, psychologists have been losing faith in that kind of approach. Mark, speak to us about self-esteem and perhaps the false marketing that self-esteem has given to us of the impact it can have.
Yeah, well, I don't know if false marketing might be taking it a bit far, Theron, but certainly you are aligned with one of the great authorities in the field, Dr. Roy Baumeister, who has done a lot of research on self-esteem, and he describes it as having been the holy grail of psychology. In other words, if we can develop people's self-esteem, then we probably are going to get a whole lot else right in their lives. And especially as psychologists, if we can help people to build their self-esteem, then they're going to function in a whole lot of more effective ways. And, a lot of this comes from the research that shows that 24 different mental disorders are directly linked to low self-esteem. And that's through Mygrow from 2006. I mean, that's a hang of a lot of disorder coming out of just one construct. So in one sense, it has been the Holy Grail. But what Roy Baumeister has been suggesting is that, self-esteem, as he defines it, is an individual's subjective evaluation of his or her worth as a person. And what he started to say is that because it's how people evaluate themselves, some of the problems with self-esteem have started coming in this valuation. It means literally placing a value on oneself. And of course, when we're valuing one thing, we of course are valuing it in relation to something else. And something that Baumeister talks about is how, while people with high self-esteem are more likely to stand up to bullies, they are also, according to the research, more likely to be bullies. So self-esteem certainly is starting to be seen not as this golden key. And something that's been emerging is this concept of compassion. Particularly self-compassion that I think we'll be chatting about a little later, Theron, which has got to do not so much with evaluating ourselves or even judging ourselves positively, but just by relating to ourselves kindly. And, I'd love to just show you one piece of research to show you how flawed, this evaluation of oneself can be. And it comes from this research that was done a little while ago now in 2002, by Crocker, Somers, and Lutanen. And they had a look at two different groups of university students, and they asked them to just rate whether their self-worth was based on their academic performance. And they actually did it on a rating scale, but they split them into two groups. Those who would say, yes, their self-worth was based on academic performance, and those who said, no, my self-worth is not related to my academic performance. And what they then did is they had a look at how these university students were applying to certain graduate degree programs. And of course, they would apply to the different universities. And you can see the team on the group on the left over there in red. If we have a look at the next slide, their self-worth was almost like a roller coaster ride. You can see on the bottom there, rejection, REJ, is when they were rejected by a particular university, and ACC is when they were accepted by a university. And you can see that their sense of self-worth fluctuated in proportion to whether they were being rejected or accepted by these different universities. Of course, in the blue over there on the right-hand side, you can see that the self-worth of the individuals that said no, their self-worth is not linked to their academic performance, they managed to maintain quite a stable state of self-worth. There was a slight fluctuation, but of course, they weren't relating who they were to whether they were accepted or rejected by these universities. I don't know if you want to just jump in and share anything there, Theron, on that point.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting to note there, I think, to pull out is that academic performance is a very codified way of ranking. You can easily rank yourself. So when you are not accepted, it means on a list of who's the cleverest, you're below what's acceptable. So it's the
Yeah.
sense of who I am, which is very easily seen in a construct like academic performance, to be able to see my own sense of value, compared to others.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah. Absolutely.
that's part of why the self-esteem idea isn't necessarily the thing that's helpful for us, because we may be cleverer than someone else, we may feel great about it. But if we're not as
Yeah.
clever as the other person, we're not going to feel. So this roller coaster you speak
Yeah.
about is not a particularly helpful way of responding to a moment of emotional, psychological wounding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if I bring it back to what you were saying, Theron, about emotional hygiene and some of Guy Winch's comments, of a broken leg. Well, the people on the left, or the group on the left, was getting a broken leg each time they were getting feedback of rejection from a university, where the ones on the right, their leg wasn't getting broken every time they were getting rejected, because they weren't linking their value to the results that were coming back at them.
Yeah.
And so this is quite key for us to understand, is if we can move away from comparison and towards self-kindness and compassion, well, then we get ourselves into a more stable and healthy emotional trajectory, the one on the right, that is not so much this kind of roller coaster ride. I'd love to share another conceptual idea with the viewers, Theron, about that comes from Lehman, who's a wonderful psychologist. He's actually, I think he's in his 70s now. He writes a lot of books on marriage, but he's been a therapist for more than 40 years. And, in his book in 2007, he just mentions this concept of this key question that we ask ourselves: do I measure up in life? And he talks about something called the high jump bar of life, that he in his practice has suggested he sees many people erecting in their lives, this kind of high jump bar that they need to try and get over. And each time they get over it, in other words, they achieve something in their life that they set for themselves, they then shift the bar a little bit higher. And I can remember so clearly, Theron, in primary school and high school, doing high jump. I mean, I was a short little guy. I couldn't run very fast or jump very high. And the teacher would set this bar a little bit higher each time, and I would run with all my might and jump with all my might, and I would knock the bar over and feel like such a failure. Maybe that's why I stuck to long distance running in the end. But, I think psychologically, this is something I've done in my life where, I feel like unless I've had first place with things, or if it's not first place, then I've said to myself, I need to get provincial in certain things. If I think back to school days. And now in a work context, I look at some other psychologists, are their articles getting as many hits? Are they being viewed as many times on Facebook? Constantly setting these high jump bars. I find myself doing it in my marriage. I find myself doing it in work, in the leadership roles that you and I play in Mygrow. I find myself thinking, are we leading as well as other people? And it's this constant benchmarking of ourselves against a high jump bar that we probably will never be able to achieve. And when I heard about this, yeah.
And the setting that bar for yourself means that you only feel worthwhile if you can accomplish that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we fall short, I think this is what Dr. Lehman was referring to, is that we seem to set the bar so high we can never achieve it. And when we fall short, we then punish ourselves. And I think it brings me to this next concept, which is just giving yourself an emotional break. If we look at just some of the way the identity develops through the subconscious mind and the narrative stories of our lives, we've already seen in previous episodes that the subconscious mind ends up being wired quite negatively, and it becomes like that devil on the shoulder that just speaks our worthlessness over us again and again. And I find myself, when I miss that high jump bar of life, often then the fight against the negative identity stories of the past becomes a very real one to start having. Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and it's one of the things Guy Winch says is, when we cut our arm, we would never dream of taking a knife and making the injury worse. We don't do that. We know what to do to take care of it. But so often when we have these psychological injuries, we do things that are the same as taking that knife. We actually make it worse. So this negative self-talk or this little voice, and we agree with it, and then we continue that conversation and get into a downward spiral. Yeah, I know you and I are slightly different on the idea of the false advertising of self-esteem, but I really just do not think it is the answer. And I've been quite convinced that self-compassion actually is the answer through the work of Dr. Kristen Neff. Look at this quote. She says, self-compassion is not a way of judging ourselves positively. Self-compassion is a way of relating to ourselves kindly, embracing ourselves, flaws and all. If we're on that roller coaster of life, constantly trying to measure up and get over that next high jump bar compared to everyone else, when we are in these difficult moments emotionally, it's only a recipe for disaster, because that's when we need, this is what Kristen Neff says, it's at that moment that we need self-esteem, and that is the moment that self-esteem drops us. So right when we need it, it can't deliver, actually. So she recommends self-compassion. She speaks about self-compassion as being something that, as I say here, is being kind to yourself, being not trying to say, oh, you're so great, don't worry, they're not even good at that thing, you're good at this. It's not about that at all. It's not about trying to show worth by value in who you are and what you can do. It's about being kind to yourself, like you would be kind to a good friend. Essentially, the trick of self-compassion is to try to be a friend to yourself, and to give yourself the support in the moments that you need it. And that's what self-compassion does so well. She breaks down 3 separate elements to self-compassion. Self-kindness is sort of what I've mentioned already here, which is the opposite of judgment. Often people are more harsh on themselves than they are on others. Well, try to be like that, like you would be with others. Try to be like that with yourself. When others are being harsh, you come and encourage. If you're being harsh on yourself, rather come and encourage yourself. The second element is common humanity. One of the things we like to say at Mygrow is that being human is not a competition. You're not more a human than someone else. We're all the same. What self-esteem does is to try and make you ask the question of, how am I unique? I'm unique. I'm in the top 10%, or whatever it is that my specialness comes from my uniqueness. Self-compassion says, how am I the same? Oh, I also struggle. Just like you're struggling with this or with that, I also struggle. I'm the same. There's a fundamentally different lens on how we look at ourselves. And then lastly, mindfulness. Now, I know mindfulness is something that it's a fairly new idea in sort of pop psychology space. Some people think it's a bit airy-fairy and a bit weird, and I get that. But it's not as, it doesn't need to be seen as something strange and weird, because actually what mindfulness is advocating is to just be present, being with what is in this moment. Not thinking about the past and the future, but trying to really just be honest with the moment. And when it comes to self-compassion, being honest with what it is you're feeling, what it is you're experiencing. Maybe you're hearing that little devil. Maybe you're feeling the guilt and the shame of not being able to be there for your children while you're trying to remote work, and that spiral is taking you downwards. Well, just accept that. Be present with that in the moment. And that actually, if we can do that, and if we can remember our common humanity, and if we can have self-kindness, that will really help when we're feeling lonely. We can say, T, you're feeling lonely right now. That's okay. And the reason you're feeling lonely is because you're alone. And it's totally fine that you're feeling that. And that sucks. I'm sorry, buddy, that's how you're feeling. The way a friend would. So those are some practical ways in which we can actually address some of this, psychological or emotional wounding that we have. So it's a great time to get our guest on for today. Our guest today is Nkobile Msomi. She's a registered counseling psychologist and a lecturer at Rhodes University. And she's had experience in the NGO sector. So she's bringing in quite a wide variety of experience to this conversation. Her interests lie in the realm of community psychology intervention. So let's get her on and see how we can benefit from her wisdom. Nkobile, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Theron. Hi, Mark.
Hi, welcome to the show today. So great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you're well. I hope the shutdown is not having too much of a detrimental impact on you.
Taking it one day at a time, and I love the discussion so far. I love how we are beckoning people to really be a container for themselves during this time. You know, as a psychotherapist, we often are containers for people, and I'm enjoying what we are talking about today, about equipping people to be containers for themselves in times of distress.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's the old tired cliche of teach a man or a woman to fish instead of giving them a fish. So yeah, that's very much the hope and the
Yes.
call of this webinar series is to empower. Now, you are someone who's on the front lines empowering people. You, as I said, you are a counseling psychologist, and you are there, in the trenches, as you've mentioned with a couple of other psychologists who've joined us. You're really there, not just discussing theory like Mark and I, but you're helping people. I'd love to get
Yes.
some of your input on what can people practically do to be that container for
Yes.
themselves and to give themselves some emotional first aid at this time.
Yes. So I've really enjoyed what you've been talking about regarding self-compassion and its properties, you know, being sensitive, sympathetic, empathizing, being non-judgmental towards ourselves. And a big part of self-compassion is really taking care of our holistic well-being.
Yeah.
And so a model I often discuss with clients, and in a model I try to implement in my own life, is the SMSPE model. And that's really turning our attention to how's my social life going? How's my mental well-being going? My spiritual well-being, my physical well-being, as well as my emotional well-being during that time. And there's certain practices that we can implement in each of those aspects on a daily basis to really create enabling environments for ourselves.
Just walk us through those again. SMS obviously isn't an old school WhatsApp. It's we're not talking about sending ourselves a message. Tell me what those letters
Yes.
mean again.
Okay, so SMSPE, S for social, M for mental, S for spiritual, P for physical, and E for emotional well-being.
Okay, I love that.
And this is what you've been talking about, is emotional hygiene. And you know, when we're speaking hygiene, we're talking about things we can do on a regular. And some things is journaling, for instance.
Yeah.
I've been journaling a lot during this time, is really externalizing my thoughts, my fears, my anxieties, sorting through feelings. Yeah, when you're feeling a bit low, untangling some thoughts.
Yeah, processing it. Yeah.
Exactly. So a practice that we can employ to maintain our emotional well-being, practicing gratitude. You know, there have been studies in sort of trauma work, how when people are going through the most extreme circumstances, how just the simple act of gratitude as identifying the protective factors in your life can really help you to remain sane and hopeful. And like you said, you know, mindfulness, and there's this big, you know, you mentioned it earlier, pop psychology around mindfulness. But what they really are calling us to do is to be here, to be present for ourselves, to practice empathy and sensitivity towards ourselves. And what I find really helpful is things like breathing techniques.
Yeah.
So simple as getting up in the morning and doing the 4-5-7 breathing technique, you know, at lunchtime, at the end of the day. And the more I practice it, the more I can activate it in times of distress when I feel overwhelmed.
Becomes a default response instead of maybe the other default responses. We're actually going to be exploring this in the next webinar around just the physiological realities around stress and how breathing is really helpful. So if this is interesting for you guys, make sure you come back to the next webinar because we're going to be dealing with this in a lot more detail.
Yes, yes. And sort of in the other aspects as well as checking in daily, you know, how's my relational tank doing? Am I reaching out to people? Do I feel that my relational tank is full? Is it empty? How can I reach out? Mentally, you know, I've started doing puzzles. I've never ever done puzzles before, but just to keep myself sharp, or Sudoku, or reading. And then
You mean
my
just to
spiritual
try
well-being.
and, sorry, on the mental, just to try and keep active so that you're not going down these
Yes.
paths of rumination or dwelling on negative things. To actually just keep your frontal lobes active and exercise. I'm assuming that's the point there.
Exactly. It's all about enabling practices for myself instead of, like you say, sitting around, which then does lead, to ruminating and catastrophizing, instead of creating tasks for ourselves to focus on. Spiritual well-being, things like prayer, lighting a candle, you know, sometimes just looking beyond ourselves, and relying on something a bit greater than ourselves can really be calming, and we can experience peace. And then physical well-being, I've been walking around the garden a bit more than normal, and there's some useful home workout videos out there, something as simple as stretching on a daily, to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, I know there's, I'm sure, for many people, some of us have actually started being more intentional about our exercise, and some of us have probably had a bit of a decline. So you know, for you guys as the viewers, it might be a time for you to just take stock of where you're at and say, do I actually need to be a little bit more intentional about this? Or a chance to realize the positive impact of some decisions you've made that have put you in a bit more of a fitness, or not fitness, but physical health mindset, which if you just take a second to just think about that and appreciate it, again, that's like focusing on the positives and empowering and building up your positive resources to help you. Is there anything else you'd like to share? We've got maybe about a minute left. So what final words of wisdom can you share with us around emotional hygiene, how we can deal with this moment, how we can be intentional about, you know, perhaps not allowing the negatives or the self-condemnation to take over?
Yes, so I think it's really worthwhile to emphasize this idea of self-compassion, and the analogy you gave by winch about, you know, if we're hurting physically, we develop strategies to help us, you know, to be compassionate. And it really is important to turn our attention towards ourselves, those of us who are parents, you know, to hold ourselves and then be able to hold children who are also experiencing a whole lot of emotions and need containing, is to just really slow down and relate to ourselves in ways we would relate to another in distress.
Well, thank you so much, Nkobile, for everything you've shared. I know the viewers will have no doubt found it very helpful and empowering, and I love that SMSPE acronym, you know, just being aware of it and pulling our attention back to each of those letters as they apply, I think will be really helpful, you know, just taking an audit and making sure we're focusing in the right ways. We're going to put a resource together just around that model, SMSPE. Did I get that right? SMSPE?
Yes.
And you can get that on the Mygrow platform. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Theron, and best wishes to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, Mark, it's always so encouraging to just hear really simple and practical, you know, help and tips from some of these psychologists. I think for many people, the field of psychology is mysterious and confusing, but actually it's so helpful. I don't know. What are your thoughts after that?
Yeah, I just want to tie together two things. The one from what Kristen Neff impressed on me, which was, we need to treat ourselves like a really good friend. And if I think of how I would treat any good friend if they were struggling, I would be full of compassion and support. And I would suggest that they go and do a whole lot of these things that Nobile was suggesting, which is give yourself a break, walk in the garden, play Sudoku, do some stuff that really is going to breathe life into you. And I would suggest that to any good friend. For the life of me, I don't know why I wouldn't do that to myself. And that's certainly what I'm taking away with me for today, Theron.
Yeah. Okay, great. We are approaching the end of this webinar, as we always do each time. Just to remind you that you can go get that free subscription to Mygrow during this time. Please go to the Mygrow website, mygrow.me, and you can sign up for that free trial. When you're on there...
And share. We are getting such great feedback. Sorry to jump in, Theron, but we're getting such great feedback from individuals, from the impact it's had for them and their families in this time. So go and share this webinar series with absolutely anyone. It's a completely free resource, and people's lives are changing for the better.
Yeah. Once you are on the Mygrow website, on the platform, should I say, you can go to that COVID-19 tab, and you can see the previous webinars if you haven't been able to track with all of them in the series. You can go watch the reruns, and then of course there are those additional resources, and we're going to make that resource available today around that SMSPE acronym of some of the different things you can do to just keep like stock and do an audit of am I putting attention and hygiene into these different elements of my life. And of course there's a number of other resources there that connect with previous webinars that we've had so far. So thanks very much. From me, I want to say goodbye. Mark, any final words from you?
Yeah, just have a good one. Be compassionate to yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Great. So you may be alone at home, you may be with others, but we're all in this together. And remember to be kind to yourself as you deal with some of the collateral stress and damage of what COVID-19 may be creating in your life. Thanks very much. We will see you in the next webinar.
Cheers.